Hello everyone. Today I thought I would share a story about something that shook my childhood and possibly the childhood of others. So this time frame would have been early to mid 80s. And this isn't something that happened in my area, but nonetheless, it shaped the way my grandparents raised me going forward. I lived with my young mother for a few years before I went to live with my grandparents permanently. And while I lived with my young mother, of course, in the 70s, we didn't have a lot of supervision. You may have heard about Gen X growing up like feral children, and it's kind of true, at least in my experience, because my mother would literally say to me and my sister, "Get out of the house and don't come back." And she meant that. Like, we weren't even allowed in, no matter how hot it was, no matter if we had shade or not. We often suffered from sunburns, and I'm not boo-hooing about it. I'm just saying it's just the way it was back then. But the point being is that that is how it was until a situation arose. My mother and her husband worked full-time, but my grandmother was retired when I went to live with my grandparents. When I lived with my young mother and her husband, I would often trot up to my neighbors in the neighborhood every weekend, and we would play. We didn't have many toys. I grew up in a very poor area with my mother, but we made do with what we had. If somebody had garbage out and we saw an old pot or pan, whether or not it had a handle, it didn't matter. To us, that was gold. We would fill it with rocks and dirt and make potato soup or pretend play with that, because that's all we had. I would be out for hours and hours and hours, and nobody would ever come looking for me until it got dark, and then I was expected to be back home. During these years growing up with my mother, what I learned from that was how to be more independent, how to look after myself, how to care for my younger sister, those types of things. I didn't have a parent doting on me. I didn't have a parent doing things for me. As many other Gen Xers share the same exact situations in their childhood as well. After a while, I went to live with my grandparents, and because they had a family farm, my grandfather years prior had built a really nice barn. We had a bull, we had chickens, we had pigs, things like that. These animals were, out in the yard. So we didn't have like a horse stable or anything like that, just to set the scene here. But we did have this beautiful barn. Now, my grandparents used that barn for things like 4th of July picnics or family get-togethers, or if somebody graduated from high school, we would have graduation parties there, because it provided shelter from the sun, it provided shelter from the rain, it had a fireplace. And when I got a little older, I had cousins that would come over because we all lived near each other and we were all playmates. So my cousins, my school friends, everybody would get together, come over and play in the barn, and we would play things like restaurant and pretend we were, mini convenience stores, things like that. Pretend play, in other words. Until one day, a story broke on national news. It brought to light the vulnerabilities in our households, such as not locking doors or letting kids loose in the neighborhoods for all hours with no supervision. So not necessarily my mother, but my grandmother, who was born in the 20s, she was from Appalachia. This news story, when it broke, it even rattled her to her core. This meant my grandmother's supervision style became a dysfunctional, micromanaging nightmare. She became obsessed, fearful, and corroded with worry. At one time during my childhood, no matter who I went to the store with, my aunt, my uncle, my grandparents, my mother, it didn't matter. They wouldn't lock the car doors. They would just say, "Sit down, be quiet, don't make a pest of yourself, just don't blare the horn or anything, just wait until I get out of the store." After this news story, though, they obsessively made sure the car doors were locked when we were left in them for their store trip, grocery trip, whatever it may be, where they left us in the car. If they left us home, every door would be locked. And we were told, don't open it to anyone. During this time as well, my grandmother actually started picking me up from school. I was no longer allowed to ride my bike home or walk home with my friends. She would be there at the front entrance waiting for me when I got out. Errands became quality time by default because she was so afraid of letting me out of her sight in public. Now, to put this in perspective, my grandmother was very young when she got married. She had many children. 5 were very rambunctious, obnoxious boys. She never parented them this way. Doors were unlocked. They were left unsupervised. I mean, I've heard stories that my uncles were actually driving their little dirt bikes off of cliffs, for goodness sakes. So you can imagine she's raising me now while she's older in life after already raising her children. And this fear took a stronghold on her. One day I had friends over after school and we were hanging in the barn. It was like this time of year, nearing the end of school year. And everybody was hanging out in the barn. There were picnic tables in there, places to chill. It was fun. And my grandmother started screaming her head off out of the kitchen window. She didn't come outside. She just stood there screaming her head off at me. Now, when I say at me, I don't mean like I was in trouble. She was that afraid. The reason for it is because the picnic tables were over from the side entrance of that barn, so she couldn't look through the door and see us hanging out there. We were all hanging out on the picnic tables just to that side of the door. So while she's screaming, it was because she thought we all disappeared. And this was a true fear she had. When I went out of the barn, you could see her face was pale. And she just said to me, stay in my sight. Do not leave my sight. And she said, also, check in. And I said, what do you mean check in? That was a new concept, you see. We didn't have to check in. We were independent little children running around, no supervision all the time. So to check in, I didn't even know what that meant. And she said, I need you to check in. If I don't come looking for you, please check in with me. And I asked her, well, what do I do? How do I do that? And she said, I want you to come in the house every 15 minutes to let me know you guys are all right. At the time, it seemed a little bit much. We weren't used to that. So my cousin was like, I'm not coming over here anymore, because my aunt and uncle, his parents, they worked. So he was left to fend for himself all day, and he had a bunch of brothers. Usually they were all up hanging out with us, but that particular day they weren't for some reason. And he was adamant that he wasn't going to come back if my grandmother kept yelling at us, because he had no idea what was going on. He didn't like it. He didn't like that new supervisory tactic she had. So when my grandparents were ready, they had me sit down in the kitchen one evening after dinner, and they explained to me that a young boy had disappeared. This didn't just change the landscape of my community. We were nowhere near where this happened, but it made, I think they called it world news or the nightly news back then. Supervision turned into a strategic maneuver. So in other words, if my grandmother had to be somewhere, when I got out of school, I had to go to an aunt's house. I could no longer go home alone. I remember one time my grandmother wanted to go on vacation, but I was there. So she took my great grandmother and she took a great aunt with her. But because of that, she made plans for another aunt to watch me for that whole week. It also changed the way my friends and I were able to hang out. I was not allowed any longer to just go around the neighborhood by myself, where once upon a time that was normal. Now we had to call ahead. My grandparents had to know that their parents were going to be home. If they weren't home, I wasn't allowed to go. And I think this may be why, for me anyway, I left when I was 17. I couldn't take it anymore because I felt like it was a little overbearing and too protective, but with good reason. So I'm going to put a thumbnail up here. I just watched this the other day, and I'm not going to tell the story because it's nicely done in this video here that I'm showing you on the screen now, but it does go into detail of everything involved. That is the case that I'm referring to, and I have a clip from it. I just want to play this because what I'm saying about how we were independent.
Adam Walsh, please come to customer service.
So in other words, the person on the loudspeaker is calling for this young boy. Now, I don't know if that's just part of their video or if that was the real actual sound effect in the department store. I'm not sure because I didn't create that video. However, think about that. Could you imagine somebody on an intercom calling for a young boy at a store? Come to the courtesy desk. Come to customer service. Your parents are looking for you. That just goes to show you how much more we were independent in those days at younger ages. Typically today, what I have observed anyway, there's also different security measures in place. They lock stores down and they have codes. Can't even imagine a child today, 6 or under, being able to navigate going to a customer service desk by themselves. I can remember 8, 9, 10 and up, I would walk barefoot around the neighborhood and show up at my aunt's house in a bathing suit with a towel wrapped around me. I would take off on a 10 speed and be out all day. We just didn't have the concerns that we have today. I think it explains anyway how, or the transition to, instead of no supervision to awareness. I think that explains somewhat, how it differs to today. In our generation, we were left out. We could go to the park, we could walk there, bike there, roller skate there, do whatever, all day without supervision. But today, you hardly see any children at a park without parental supervision, or without a parent pushing them on a swing, or without a parent interacting with them. But years ago, it was just a bunch of kids. We didn't have parents there. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.